Dr. Mark Mitchell is with us, and he's not in Iowa, so he's in Cincinnati, Ohio. But we are very fortunate to have Dr. Mitchell talk to us today. He's with the U.S. EPA. He's an ORISE postdoctoral researcher, and he's been working with a number of folks looking at habitat implications of ag drainage improvements and wetland restoration in Iowa. I think he's been doing some really unique modeling of that. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Mitchell. And as we go through this, if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get those to Mark at the end of his talk. With that, I will turn it over to Mark.
All right. Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for having me today. See if we can get this working here. All right, so today I'm going to be presenting work resulting from a collaborative research effort between the US EPA's Region 7, EPA's Office of Research and Development, the EPA's Office of Water, and several stakeholder groups in Iowa. Before we start, I want to say that I recognize much of this audience is likely very familiar with agricultural systems and the issues at stake here in Iowa. But for those attending that are less familiar, I will be providing some background on the issues at stake. We also should have plenty of time at the end for questions. And please do not hesitate to send me an email if you have additional questions. So the goal of this project is to support EPA's Region 7 and work with key stakeholders in the state of Iowa to identify and describe the broad ecosystem service benefits gained from the installation of water quality wetlands. The stakeholders shown here, which are involved in agricultural research, conservation, and education, met 7 times and identified the relevance of studying water quality wetlands and drainage improvements in Iowa. As many of you are probably aware, Iowa is one of the most productive states for crops in the country. For example, in 2019, Iowa produced more corn than any other state, representing 19% of the total U.S. corn market. And Iowa was second only to Illinois in soy production in 2019, with Iowa's production making up 14% of the U.S. market. However, Iowa also contributes a large share of the nitrogen and phosphorus that enters the Gulf of Mexico each year, which contributes to algal blooms and can result in low oxygen concentrations in the water column that endanger aquatic organisms. Additionally, because of the huge expansion of agriculture and to a lesser degree urban areas over the last 100 or so years, Iowa has lost at least 19% of its historical wetland ecosystems and a large portion of its grassland habitat. The widespread land use changes from a landscape dominated primarily by grassland, forests, and wetlands to widespread cropland are clearly seen in these images of the state, showing compiled land use covers obtained from pre-settlement land surveys in the mid-1800s compared to satellite land cover data from 2001. Note that much of the historic wetland habitat shown in light blue prior to expansion of cropland was located in this region that I have circled here. The circled area roughly indicates the area that was most recently glaciated, with glaciers leaving behind depressions that are commonly called pothole wetlands. And this region is referred to as the Des Moines lobe of Iowa, with the entire Des Moines lobe spanning from central Iowa to central Minnesota. Agricultural expansion, including the addition of subsurface drainage systems to remove excess soil water from fields, is largely responsible for the loss of these wetland habitats in the region. And just to give you an image of how these systems have changed, the landscape in the 1800s would have looked a lot like the picture here on the left, which is an aerial image of the prairie pothole region in Canada today. But presently, this region looks like the image on the right, where former pothole wetlands are drained and planted with corn and soy, but still hold water seasonally in these landscape depressions. In Iowa alone, there are more than 173,000 of these landscape depressions, which would historically have served as wetland habitat, but are now drained and actively farmed. However, the drainage systems installed more than a century ago are in many cases under-designed for modern agriculture or underperforming and result in regular crop losses within these crop depressions. And when I say drainage, just so we're all on the same page, I'm mostly referring to the subsurface pipes that collect water and remove it from the catchment. So this graphic here on the right shows an illustration of a catchment or small watershed. The subsurface field tiles, which are indicated here in red, drain the agricultural fields and connect with larger pipes called lateral and main drainage tiles. And these all remove excess water from the catchment. So while field tile is easier and cheaper to update since it is generally smaller diameter piping and can be done by the landowner themselves, the main and lateral tiles span many properties in a catchment and are governed by what is termed a drainage district in Iowa. Drainage districts mostly align with the boundaries of the catchment and typically range from 1,000 to 3,000 acres. The drainage district lateral and main tile systems carry drainage from the entire catchment, and in much of Iowa were installed between 1900 and 1925. The current drainage systems are therefore not designed for modern agricultural production, and in many cases are degraded and therefore underperforming, serving as essentially a bottleneck that causes water to drain slowly from fields regardless of the field tile condition or layout. Drainage improvements will likely reduce crop losses and therefore improve overall catchment yields, but may affect water quality leaving the catchment and wildlife habitat. However, the impacts of drainage improvements on water quality and habitat are not well understood. Constructing water quality wetlands, which are systems designed to capture a large portion of the water leaving an agricultural watershed and treat it so that there are lower levels of nitrogen moving downstream, may also provide much needed habitat for amphibians, as well as waterfowl and other organisms. Water quality wetlands also may provide other benefits, such as recreational and educational opportunities. However, the full suite of ecosystem services provided by water quality wetlands and their ability to mitigate habitat and water quality changes associated with drainage improvements have not been adequately explored. Working together, EPA's Region 7, the Office of Research and Development, and the Iowa Stakeholder Group identified 4 land management scenarios that could affect agricultural production and relevant ecosystem services for the region. The scenarios include a baseline no change scenario with underperforming drainage infrastructure and no water quality wetlands. So note here that crop depressions or farm wetlands, if they are classified as such, are still likely to seasonally flood and result in crop losses in this scenario. The updated drainage scenario consists of updating the tile drainage system mains and laterals so that the system can remove a ½ inch of water per day. Note that upgrading the drainage system means that any crop depressions classified as farm wetlands are considered converted and will require mitigation. The water quality wetland scenario consists of the installation of a water quality wetland without drainage improvements. And note here that the crop depressions are intact in this scenario. And finally, the all-in scenario includes a water quality wetland and tile drainage infrastructure upgrades. So in this case, the crop depressions, if they are classified as farm wetlands, are considered converted, but the water quality can potentially serve to mitigate their loss. It is also worth pointing out here that this mitigation strategy provides wetland functions and services such as habitat close to the converted areas. In addition to the model scenarios, the Iowa Stakeholder Group also identified ecosystem service and agricultural production priorities for the region. Services identified as the highest priority by the stakeholder group were corn and soy production and water quality. Farmers want to maintain or improve their crop yields, and there's clearly a need for improving water quality coming from the region. Supporting habitat and biodiversity, regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and regulating groundwater and surface water flow were also recognized as priorities for the region, followed by the cultivation of educational services and general environmental awareness. So today, I'm going to focus on the habitat and biodiversity work, but note that we're continuing to assess these other aspects as well. So in order to assess the habitat implications of drainage improvements and water quality wetlands, we are studying 37 potential water quality wetland sites and their drainage districts located in the Des Moines lobe of Iowa. And this is being done in partnership with collaborators at Iowa State. The blue areas within the Des Moines lobe shown here are our 37 model catchments and are chosen as sites that are geographically distributed and as potential sites that satisfy the basic requirements for conservation reserve and enhancement program, also known as CREP, water quality wetland sites. And then for each one of these 37 catchments, we use spatially explicit habitat and crop pollination models in the INVEST model suite to model amphibian and grassland bird habitat quality and wild bee pollinator abundance for the scenarios with drainage improvements and water quality wetland additions. Habitat models were adapted from models developed for the region by Dave Mouchet and collaborators, and crop pollination models were adapted from models developed by Eric Lonsdorf and collaborators. After selecting catchments, we overlaid map locations of landscape depressions on top of land cover layers so that depressions were identified as unique depressional land use types. For example, depressional soy, depressional corn, or depressional grassland land cover classes. So I think you all should be able to see my cursor here. The green portions are indicating areas where soy was planted in this case, 2019. Just lost my cursor, there we go. The darker green areas are depressions where soy is planted. Similarly, the yellow is where corn was planted, and the dark yellow is where corn was planted in a depression, just to give you an idea of what's going on with that map. All wetland and depressional land was then identified as potential habitat for amphibians, while all grassland habitat was identified as potential grassland bird habitat. Published expert opinion estimates for wild bee floral and nesting resources were used to model the relative abundance of 10 different species or genera of bees. For amphibian and grassland bird models, habitat quality and potential habitat cells was degraded by nearby threats on the landscape. And then areas with habitat quality scores greater than a threshold value were then counted as suitable amphibian or grassland bird habitat. Threats to amphibian habitat included the presence of cropland within 1 kilometer, habitat isolation, and wetland permanence, with permanent systems threatening amphibians due to the potential for fish presence and temporary systems threatening amphibian habitat due to their tendency to dry out regularly. Threats to grassland birds were nearby urban areas, roads, woodlands, and croplands. So just to demonstrate for amphibian habitat quality, here is the land cover layer for amphibian habitat in the baseline scenario, where crop depressions are still likely to flood seasonally and can potentially serve as amphibian habitat. So amphibian habitat in this crop depression, planted with soy in this case, in the baseline scenario, would be degraded by the threat of nearby cropland and the threat of drying out, as drain landscape depressions typically are only inundated with water for short periods of time and therefore are expected to regularly dry out and threaten amphibian populations. Amphibian habitat quality in these non-isolated semi-permanent wetlands would be degraded only by nearby cropland. So note that they occur within a crop depression, but are identified as semi-permanent herbaceous wetlands in land cover layers based on satellite imagery, and therefore are unlikely to dry out regularly like the surrounding depressional area. In scenarios where modeled water quality wetlands were constructed at the base of the catchment, this semi-permanent water quality wetland would only be degraded by nearby cropland, as it is not isolated from other wetland habitat in this case, and is semi-permanent and therefore unlikely to provide fish habitat or regularly dry out. And then in scenarios with drainage improvements, like the all-in scenario with drainage improvements and water quality wetlands shown here, any suitable habitat within depressions within the catchment boundary were considered lost, as these areas were considered converted when drainage was improved. So just to go back, you can see these depressions, and any suitable habitat within those depressions is considered lost in the improved drainage scenarios. So here are amphibian habitat model results for 4 example catchments. Just as a reminder, we modeled 37 catchments throughout the Des Moines lobe, and so these are just 4 example catchments. Blue pixels here indicate suitable amphibian habitat in all the scenarios, while green pixels indicate additional amphibian habitat due to the addition of the water quality wetland. And then finally, red pixels indicate the loss of suitable habitat due to model drainage improvements. And I know this is kind of hard to see, so we're going to zoom in to the second catchment here for a closer look. So in this case, almost the entire conservation easement, which is delineated here in black and surrounding the water quality wetland, which is outlined in orange, is operating as suitable amphibian habitat. So the green portions are gains in suitable amphibian habitat due to the addition of the water quality wetland. Additionally, 2 small patches of suitable amphibian habitat were lost due to drainage improvements. So in this case, these patches are located in depressions and were found to be suitable amphibian habitat in the baseline no change scenario because they are located nearby other wetland habitat, that's the blue pixels, and non-cropland land cover. In this case, large tracts of grassland and fallow fields that are nearby. For grassland bird habitat, here are those same 4 model catchments shown earlier with model results for grassland birds. So as you can see, drainage improvements had only minimal effects on grassland bird habitat in these catchments. And adding a water quality wetland in these catchments resulted in gains in grassland habitat as shown by the green pixels. Note that habitat gains are only in the surrounding conservation easement, as wetlands do not provide grassland bird habitat in this model. Also note that in some cases, the addition of the water quality wetland resulted in habitat losses when the water quality wetland was located in existing grassland habitat as shown by the red pixel. So you can see here. And for wild bee abundance, here is an example modeled catchment shown with each panel representing one of the 4 scenarios. So this is one catchment and each panel represents a different scenario. So panel A shows the baseline no change scenario. Panel B shows the improved drainage scenario. Panel C shows the water quality wetland scenario. And panel D shows the all-in scenario with drainage improvements and water quality wetlands. And hot colors here indicate higher wild bee abundances than cooler colors. So focusing in on this portion of the catchment within the black rectangle that has herbaceous wetlands in that baseline no change scenario, improving drainage results in the loss of these depressional wetlands, and in this case, a decline in the relative bee abundance. Adding a water quality wetland to the base of this catchment, in this case, resulted in gains in wild bee relative abundance within the water quality wetland, as well as the surrounding conservation easement. So taking a look at the summary results across all 37 catchments, improving drainage resulted in a 3% decline in suitable amphibian habitat, while adding water quality wetlands to all catchments resulted in a 25% increase in amphibian habitat. However, modeled water quality wetlands that were isolated from other wetland habitat and surrounded mostly by cropland did not provide any additional amphibian habitat. The scenario with drainage improvements in water quality wetlands experienced a 22% increase in amphibian habitat, suggesting that water quality wetlands are likely to offset amphibian habitat losses due to drainage improvements. However, the total amphibian habitat quality score did decline substantially with drainage improvements, as depressional areas that were not found to serve as suitable habitat experienced large declines in their habitat quality score. And these declines were not completely offset by the addition of the water quality wetland. Wild bee total pollinator abundance across 10 different species or genera experienced minimal declines in relative abundance due to drainage improvements, but increased by 10% in scenarios with water quality wetlands. And then finally, grassland bird habitat experienced minimal gains due to drainage improvements, but adding water quality wetlands increased habitat and the total habitat quality score by 5%. So in summary, water quality wetlands and their surrounding conservation easements are likely to supply much needed amphibian, grassland bird, and pollinator habitat in this region, while also offsetting habitat losses due to drainage improvements. However, as I mentioned, only 17 of our 37 water quality wetland conservation easement complexes in our model provided suitable amphibian habitat. So if suitable amphibian habitat is a desired outcome, the habitat surrounding a potential water quality wetland site should be considered during the planning process to reduce the threat of nearby cropland and habitat isolation. Alternatively, water quality wetlands could be installed in groups to reduce the effects of habitat isolation and the effects of the surrounding landscape. Additionally, while it did not impact suitable habitat, more research is required to assess the reductions in the amphibian habitat quality score due to drainage improvements. Further, while waterfowl are likely to inhabit similar environments as amphibians, their needs and ability to move to alternative habitats necessitates an independent waterfowl model. And this is something we're working on with waterfowl experts currently with the goal of developing an invest waterfowl model. And the hope being that we can improve our understanding of the potential effects of drainage improvements in water quality wetland additions on these organisms. And then finally, additional metrics such as water quality benefits and net greenhouse gas effects are needed to fully address the impacts and trade-offs of drainage improvements and water quality wetlands. And as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we are currently working on modeling these aspects. For example, modeling agricultural fields with and without drainage improvements to assess the potential impacts of drainage improvements on crop yields, water quality, total flows, and greenhouse gas exchange. Further, we're working on incorporating wetland models for water quality, hydrology, and greenhouse gases to assess if water quality wetlands are likely to have the capacity to mitigate any resulting impacts from drainage improvements. And this work, combined with our habitat modeling work, our hope is that it will help to inform future land management decisions in Iowa. With that, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of folks who have contributed directly to this work or who have been instrumental in getting this project started, including our collaborators in Iowa, Dr. Bill Crumpton, Dr. Matt Helmers, Sean Richmond, Matt Lechtenberg, Dean Lemke, Roger Bruner, Jake Hansen, and Rick Robinson. We'd like to thank Region 7 for developing and including us in this project, as well as our collaborators in the EPA's Office of Water and the Office of Research and Development. And I would like to thank my ORISE mentors, Ken Forshea, Timmy Newcomer-Johnson, and Brian Dyson for their help and guidance and the opportunity to do this really, I think, interesting work. And also collaborators Jake Christensen, Tim Canfield, and Sean Shiflett for their contributions to this work. With that, here are the full references for material that was referenced in this presentation, including our paper that's currently in review and our forthcoming paper that should be published in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in the next few months. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, folks, thanks, Mark. As folks type in any other questions, maybe we can go to the next one. So if you are on here and need a CCA continuing education credit, please email Liz Ripley, ejukums@iastate.edu. by Wednesday today at 5 p.m. with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And if you can go to the next slide, we'll just put in a plug for Dr. Keith Schilling, the state geologist and director of the Iowa Geological Survey. We'll be on next week to talk about contribution of stream banks to phosphorus exports in Iowa. And with that, there are a couple questions in here. First one was, how were the CREP sites identified, manually or by the model?
Yeah, so they were identified manually. So we actually one of our collaborators used to work for IDLES, and so is very familiar with the site selection. And so they were identified and delineated according to the same methods that IDLES uses for CREP locations. And so they were all representative of existing CREP water quality wetland sites.
Okay, the next one was, it sounds like the models include grassland birds, but not waterfowl and wading birds. That would seem like an important to evaluate those wildlife impacts. Can you discuss that, or maybe there were limitations with the model there?
Yes, and maybe this wasn't clear from my presentation, but yes, we did not model waterfowl, and that's definitely something that we're continuing to work on. We're working with waterfowl experts to develop a model specifically for that purpose of evaluating the potential effects of drainage improvements and water quality wetland additions on waterfowl. So yes, absolutely, that's something that we're interested in and working on.
And feel free, if folks continue to type in some questions. Okay. There was a question on those the sites. Were any of the modeled sites existing CREP wetlands that you know of?
No, none of them were existing.
Okay, none of them were. They just were ones that would fit.
But yeah, sorry, potential sites, they satisfy the requirements.
So this person said they understand, assuming the improved drainage only changes the current crop acres, or their assumption from what you talked about is that the improved drainage only changes the current crop acres, but does not include that with the improved drainage capacity, there may be some land conversions, such as land enrolled in CRP, idled, or pasture. So is that correct? And is there any thoughts on how at least from those watersheds that you looked at, how much land there might have been that wasn't in crop production that you could envision going, it might be taken out, I guess, or
so
if it wasn't.
The assumption, we took a sort of worst case scenario approach. So we assumed that any land within these depressional boundaries would be basically converted in terms of its function, its crop yields to an upland productivity. So yes, we did not incorporate land use change with that drainage. The assumption is that the land use would stay the same. But yes, that's something that we're interested in. It's a great point that that land use may actually change with that drainage improvement.
And it said, but only in the crop depressions. Is that right?
Yes, only in the crop depressions. Exactly. And only within the catchment as well. So anything outside of the catchment was not affected by drainage improvements. That's an assumption of our model.
Yeah, and I think one of the things could be an interesting aspect to look at is, so many of these areas may not have much of that land to even. It's almost all row crop as it is right now. It's kind of an interesting question, maybe to examine some of these other locations. Okay, another one here. Got a couple more. How was the pollinator habitat quality quantified in the model? Was it based on production of flowers, acres planted, all being equal, or a combination?
So it's actually, to clarify, it's not truly pollinators. It's actually quantifying an index for bee species. So it's based on the land use and a corresponding floral resource value for each land use. And then similarly, for each land use, a nesting potential. And again, this is all being done by bee species. And that information was gleaned from prior studies.
The next one, is there any evidence that cropped, poorly drained depressions provide much viable amphibian habitat?
So the assumption here was that, and in my experience, not certainly not high quality habitat, from what I've seen in the literature and the folks I've talked to. Um, but the assumption here with our model was that they can potentially serve as habitats, right? But they're going to be threatened by the potential for drying up, um, and uh, and of course the surrounding cropland. And so if those threats are, if a depression is buffered by the surrounding landscape, from cropland, then it could potentially serve as wetland habitat in this model. The threats are additive, so basically every crop depression is going to be threatened by that threat of drying up, and so it really comes down to the surrounding land use.
And I guess one of the things that kind of thinking about your modeling that's being done, that would some of that hydrologic modeling might get at what would be the impact of the hydrology of improving the drainage in these crop depressional areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So for this that I presented today, the assumption was, like I said, a worst case scenario. So that basically improving the drainage for this modeling effort assumes that basically that depression converts to upland hydrology and functionality. So yes, absolutely. Like I said, a worst case scenario approach.
Kind of under that scenario, it's kind of assuming the limitation for draining that pothole is because of the tile main, not because of any soil limitation there. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. So just to clarify here, this modeling is all based on, and this is again working with Iowa stakeholders. The interest was improving the drainage coefficient, so improving the actual tile mains and laterals to reduce any backlog. So not actually influencing the field drains at all, and that's something that really has not been evaluated, at least to my understanding.
Yeah, because there's great kind of a good segue into a clarifying point, that improving that drainage on the catchment scale is done by the drainage district by improving that drainage main. This hasn't factored in that there might be subsequent improvements of drainage in field drainage by individual landowners.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the assumption is that the drainage would be improved by improving the tile drainage system mains and laterals. But yeah, absolutely, it does not include any subsequent changes after that point. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much. While I do my spiel of reiterating the next webinar and the CCA, if anybody has a burning question they want to get in, feel free to do so. But again, next week, same time, same Zoom location, we'll have Dr. Schilling talking about contribution of stream banks to phosphorus export in Iowa. And again, if you need a CCA CEU, please send those to ejukums@iastate.edu. There was another question here.
That happened again.
Okay. There was one about how, kind of specific to drainage districts, do drainage districts receive funding from a specific source, or how would they fund the replacement of that main line? And that would be done, those drainage districts are paying for that. So the individual landowners in that district, if that improvement project is going forward, that's how they're being done. So once in a while, if you're in local, you may see some local papers in north central Iowa where they will list out the drainage assessments if a drainage project goes forward. I still have in my office somewhere the paper from my hometown in northwest Iowa that gives what the drainage assessments would be for a new district. So okay, with that, I think that's what I saw. So thank you, Mark, for this contribution and for giving the webinar today. And we will hope to see many of you next week. So with that, I will stop the recording.